Hello, dear viewers. Welcome back to Nova World News Now. I'm Nova. Here are the key highlights of today's news. Donald Trump stood at the podium and declared something that sounded powerful, confident, and final. He said America didn't need Canadian oil. He said America had more energy than anyone else. He said tariffs would make America stronger. But here's the part no one explained to the public. America doesn't just buy Canadian oil. America is built around it. The pipelines, the refineries, the pricing system, even inflation itself. All of it quietly depends on one country Washington thought it could bully. And when Trump decided to pressure Canada with tariffs, he believed the damage would be one-sided. What actually happened was something very different, because Canada didn't panic, Canada didn't shout, Canada didn't even retaliate right away. Instead, it allowed the math to speak. And once the numbers were understood, Washington realized something too late. This wasn't a trade dispute anymore. It was a leverage trap. And the United States had already stepped into it. When Trump signed his executive orders imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, the message was simple. Pressure Canada, force concessions, prove American dominance. A 25% tariff hit most Canadian imports. Energy received what was described as a lighter 10% tariff. On paper, it looked reasonable. In political messaging, it sounded harmless. In reality, it was the most dangerous part of the plan. Trump's team framed it as proof of restraint. A White House official explicitly stated the lower energy tariff was chosen to minimize impacts on gasoline and home heating prices. But energy markets don't react to speeches. They react to dependency. And that dependency had already been locked in long before Trump ever entered office. Here's the number that changes everything. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, 62% of all U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. Every single day, over 4.1 million barrels of Canadian oil flow into American refineries. That oil fuels cars, powers factories, stabilizes gas prices, and keeps inflation from spiraling. This isn't casual trade. This is structural reliance. Canadian crude isn't just another supplier on a list. It's the backbone of U.S. energy security, especially in the Midwest and Great Lakes regions. Remove it, even partially, and the system doesn't adjust smoothly. It starts to choke. Trump's tariff plan didn't account for that because you can't replace that volume overnight. You can't reroute pipelines instantly. You can't re-engineer refineries with a press conference. And once that reality became clear, the pressure quietly shifted, not toward Canada, but back toward the United States itself. This is where the situation became irreversible. U.S. refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are custom-built for Canadian heavy crude. They are calibrated for its density, sulfur content, and flow characteristics. Switching suppliers isn't a political decision. It's a technical nightmare. According to the International Energy Agency, Canadian crude made up 100% of imports into the Midwest, accounting for 72% of the region's refinery crude runs. These refineries have no viable alternative. They invested billions over decades specifically to process heavy Canadian oil sands crude. If Canadian oil slows, refineries stall. If refineries stall, gasoline prices spike. If gasoline spikes, inflation follows immediately. This isn't speculation, it's mechanical reality. And suddenly, the 10% tariff didn't look small anymore. It looked reckless because the United States wasn't threatening Canada. It was threatening its own fuel system. And that's when Ontario Premier Doug Ford entered the picture. Doug Ford didn't scream. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten retaliation with emotion. He did something far more unsettling. He spoke calmly. Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 American states: Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. He estimated it would add about $100 per month to the bills of affected Americans. And then he delivered the line that rattled Washington. If the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely. Believe me when I say I do not want to do this. I feel terrible for the American people, because it's not the American people who started this trade war. It's one person who's responsible. That's President Trump. That calm confidence mattered because it signaled leverage. Ford reminded the world that American refineries were engineered around Canadian crude, not the other way around. The message was subtle but devastating. Canada wasn't desperate. Canada wasn't cornered. Canada was patient, and patience, backed by energy control, is power. Here's the moment most people completely missed. Canada never shut off the oil. Canada never announced sanctions. Canada never needed to escalate. Ottawa simply acknowledged one thing that carried enormous weight. Retaliation remained on the table. That was it. No drama, no deadlines, just a quiet acknowledgement that energy was an option. And that was enough to send shockwaves through markets, because everyone who actually understands energy logistics knew what that sentence meant. If Canadian oil were disrupted, even slightly, the consequences wouldn't be symbolic. They would be immediate. Midwest refineries would face shortages, gasoline prices would climb. According to Gas Buddy analysts, consumers in the Northeast could see prices rise 20 to 40 cents per gallon within weeks. Midwest drivers would face increases of 10 to 25 cents per gallon. Diesel costs would surge across trucking and agriculture. Inflation, the very thing Trump promised tariffs would crush, would spike fast. And here's the key detail. Canada didn't need to do anything for this to work. The possibility alone forced reactions. Energy analysts recalculated risk models. Investors adjusted positions. Refinery operators quietly warned policymakers that there was no quick fix if Canadian supply slowed. Canada wasn't bluffing, but it also wasn't rushing. It understood something Trump's team overlooked. In modern trade wars, leverage doesn't come from action first. It comes from position. Canada held the valve. And when you control something that essential, restraint becomes more powerful than retaliation. What happened next exposed the biggest flaw in Trump's tariff strategy. It didn't hurt Canada first. It hit the United States. The energy tariff was sold as protection for American consumers. Instead, it set off warning signs across the very system it was supposed to strengthen. This was the boomerang Trump never accounted for. Tariffs don't exist in isolation. They travel through supply chains, pricing models, and consumer costs. And when the product involved is energy, the shock multiplies. Higher fuel prices don't just affect drivers. They raise food prices, shipping costs, airline fares, and manufacturing expenses all at once. That's why inflation fears resurfaced almost immediately. The same administration that promised tariffs would lower prices now faced the reality that energy tariffs do the opposite. They amplify instability. They inject uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. And Canada didn't need to say a word. The pressure wasn't coming from Ottawa anymore. It was coming from inside the U.S. economy itself. Businesses began pushing back quietly. Industry voices warned policymakers that this path was unsustainable. The cost of winning the trade war was starting to look higher than the cost of compromise. For weeks, Trump repeated the same line. The United States didn't need Canadian oil. America had more than enough of its own. The tariffs would prove it. But behind closed doors, a very different conversation was happening. Energy officials knew the truth. Industry leaders knew it too. Replacing Canadian crude wasn't a switch you could flip. It wasn't even a medium-term solution. It would take years of infrastructure changes, billions in investment, and acceptance of higher risk. The U.S. had confused production capacity with usability. Yes, America produces a lot of oil, but not all oil is interchangeable. American shale produces light, sweet crude. Canadian oil sands produce heavy, sour crude. Midwest refineries are specifically designed for the heavy stuff. You can't swap them. Canada's leverage wasn't political. It was mechanical. That's what made it so dangerous. But here's what Trump didn't anticipate. The biggest turning point didn't come from politics. It came from infrastructure. Canada's Trans Mountain expansion pipeline became fully operational, nearly tripling capacity to 890,000 barrels per day. Suddenly, Canada had an exit ramp that didn't exist before, and China seized the opportunity. According to energy data firm KP, Canadian crude oil exports to China surged from an average of 7,000 barrels per day over the previous decade to 207,000 barrels per day. China became the largest buyer of crude through the new pipeline, surpassing even the United States for Pacific Coast shipments. Canadian exports to non-U.S. countries grew by 60% year over year, setting a new record. The price discount on Canadian crude narrowed from $15 $20 per barrel to just $10 $12 per barrel. This means Canada now has real bargaining power. They're no longer locked into a single customer. This was the moment Trump didn't plan for, the moment when strength turned into exposure. Not because Canada attacked, but because reality refused to bend. By the time this became obvious, the damage was already done. The tariffs hadn't demonstrated dominance. They had revealed dependence. In October, the U.S. Senate voted 50-46 to pass a resolution that would nullify tariffs imposed on Canadian imports, with 4 Republicans joining Democrats in a rare rebuke of Trump's trade policy. In the end, this tariff war didn't conclude with a dramatic announcement or a public surrender. It ended much more quietly, with understanding. Trump set out to pressure Canada, believing tariffs would force compliance and showcase American strength. What he uncovered instead was a reality Washington had grown comfortable ignoring. The U.S. economy wasn't just trading with Canada. It was structured around it. Canada never needed to retaliate loudly. It never needed to cut supply or escalate the conflict. All it had to do was stand still and let the system react. Energy markets, refineries, investors, and businesses did the rest. They understood what political messaging tried to gloss over. That control over critical inputs matters more than slogans. This wasn't a moral victory or a political stunt. It was a lesson in leverage. Canada didn't win because it shouted louder. It won because it controlled something essential. Oil flows don't care about ideology. Pipelines don't respond to bravado. Infrastructure doesn't bend to pressure. That's what made this episode so revealing. Trump's tariffs were designed to expose Canadian weakness. Instead, they exposed American dependence. They showed that power in the modern global economy isn't about who talks toughest. It's about who understands the system best. By the time Washington fully grasped this, the narrative had already flipped. Canada wasn't scrambling. Canada wasn't cornered. Canada was waiting. And that waiting changed everything. This wasn't the story of a trade war won with force. It was the story of how silence, positioning, and cold numbers can defeat aggression. A reminder that in today's world, the strongest countries aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that quietly keep everything running. If you want to understand the geopolitical turning points reshaping the world, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in the game of global power, those who understand first always have the advantage.